wonderful to have known Dr. Hollis. I would like to acknowledge her for working so hard, of course, with the Center for African American Studies in putting this very lecture together. Dr. Hollis, please give her a hand of applause. It reminds me my days as a graduate student. You know, it's always good to have a public lecture of this nature, where you invite experts, renowned scholars, artists, to visit campus, to share their expertise and experience with students, faculty, staff, and the public, to engage the campus community. You agree with me that our Museum Studies program has taken the lead. You know, this is something that our graduate students need. We have also collaborated with the Museum Studies program. The last collaboration was the accession that they did, the work with our collections curator, Ms. Hill, to accession over 1,100 African artifacts. The quality of work that they put into the proposal, an evaluator came the other day to the Senate. We produced the proposal, and she could not believe. She said, "Which students?" I said, "Our credit students." And she was extremely excited. She was happy for the quality of work that we do. Really, I would also like to thank Dr. Jean. He has also been very, very wonderful. The students talk so good of him. Dr. Jean. And of course, I also want to acknowledge the presence of our Dean, the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Dr. Mokosso. Again, to our graduate students and to our faculty and to our staff and members of the public, you're welcome to this special lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Students, faculty members, and members of the public. We are all aware that SUNO always wants to expose its students to great ideas, to knowledge, and to great scholars. It is with this understanding that we brought Dr. Long here, a man of great knowledge, a man who has traveled the world and has made contributions in knowledge and in his writings. I'm very, very pleased that he's here. You have to drink as a graduate student. You must drink from the wealth of knowledge of people. I expected more students here. In fact, we want to create an academic atmosphere in this university unrivaled or equal to others. We don't want people to say, what happens, nothing happens at SUNO, as they used to say. Things have changed, you know that. And therefore, we will want our graduate students to show themselves that they are equal to other students elsewhere, so that if there's an occasion like this, an eminent scholar comes here and you have just a few graduate students around. That is very, very discouraging. So please tell your friends that when an occasion like this comes, they should come around and drink from the wealth of knowledge of eminent scholars. And I have to congratulate Dr. Hollis. You know, this program is her baby. She built it. And when it was declining, we brought her back. And it is growing. So please, don't get out of this university without knowing some eminent scholars. So, with this, I just take my place and eminent scholar speaks, and you must drink. Remember what I'm saying? Drink from the wealth of his knowledge and experience. Thank you.
Dr. Long was my advisor on my dissertation. He was the head of African American Studies and the doctoral program, Doctor of Arts and Humanities at Atlanta University. And I can tell you that of all the people I've ever studied with, he was absolutely the top. And I'm very grateful. And I've stayed in touch with him all these years and heard him speak. Many of you have met him at occasions that we've had in museum studies. He comes to New Orleans. But in between coming to New Orleans, he travels all over the world. And he told me, don't go do a long introduction because in the back of your program, we have put a bio so that you can read that. But I do want to say that Dr. Long has published a number of books, and please be sure to read the list here of all the books. I am absolutely thrilled to death to present to all of you gathered here. Would everybody in museum studies please raise your hand? And everybody that's graduated in museum studies, please raise your hand. Okay. I think there'll be more people who are probably trying to park out there right now, but will be coming in. But I'm very humbled. I've been at SUNO. I started here in 1973. And I can tell you that this place is just absolutely amazing. We may still be in mostly in trailers, but our students are here. And wonderful scholars are here, artists are here. I think the person that came the farthest to hear a lecture tonight came from Egypt, Mr. Eve, an artist who's one of our graduate scholars. But I have to say that it is the students that have made this program important. Because when we started out, we got a lot of cooperation from museums here in designing the program. But still, there were people that were kind of like, SUNO is going to be the only person in the state with museum studies. But you all who are in the program, who have graduated from the program, who've worked with the program, and of course, I have to give respect to my dean, Dr. Mokosso. You all have really made this program on the map in this city, and I'm so pleased. Dr. Long, you have given us so much support all the way along since we started, and I'm so thrilled that tonight you're going to be able to share one of your favorite places. And you know Dr. Long takes scholars to Paris, so you have to talk to him about that.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to have the occasion to talk about Paris and to talk about museum. So I'm bringing two delights of mine together in this informal survey. And we will have a number of images here, and my remarks will relate to the images. And when you talk about Paris, inevitably, of course, you talk about going to the Louvre. So we will start with a picture of the facade of the Louvre. This is the major facade of the Louvre, even though people who go to Paris and don't pay much attention to this facade. Why? All right, this is the facade of the Palace of the Louvre, which was created around 1660 by a French architect whose name was Perrault, and this is called the Colonnade. And it was created during the reign of Louis the 16th. But shortly after this facade was completed, Louis the 16th decided for various reasons that he didn't want to live in the Louvre and he didn't want to live in Paris. He moved to Versailles, which of course is another marvelous story. And therefore the Louvre became a sort of miscellaneous place. Not only members of the royal family were there, but lots of other people were there off and on over the years. And it became a museum after the revolution, after the beginning of the revolution, around 1792. They actually passed, they would have a museum there in the Louvre. Let's look at the next one. Now this, we have rushed through the years, the museum developed over the years, but the museum was mainly in the southern wing of the palace. About 30 years ago, the museum people, who were very, very strong-minded, finally were able to take over most of the palace, only about 30-some years ago. And therefore they had to devise an entrance to the palace, to the museum, that you could manage. And so the entrance was this pyramid, and you all have already heard about it, done by the Chinese-American architect I.M. Pai. And it caused great controversy. There were people in France who decided to get very sick, but this is part of the history of Paris. You know, you talk about the Eiffel Tower, and then when that came out, they all got very sick. And so on. But you get used to it. So eventually, of course, people in Paris accept the Eiffel Tower, and now they're beginning to accept the pyramid as well. But it's a magnificent entrance into this museum, the largest museum in the world. Now, museums in Paris are not just, you know, at the Louvre. We're going to move in a few moments to talk about some small museums devoted to single artists. But this building that we have here is a modern palace constructed in 1937. It is the Palais de Chaillot. As a matter of fact, it's right across from the Louvre, from the Eiffel Tower. And as a matter of fact, this photograph is taken from the Eiffel Tower. Thousands of people a day come here, but they don't even know the building is a museum building. They stand on that terrace looking at the Eiffel Tower and so on. However, in this palace, you have a museum of French monuments, a huge museum. You have a museum of the French Navy, a huge museum. You have the Musée de l'Homme, which is an anthropological museum, another huge museum, all within this one building. Well, the average tourist, of course, doesn't need to go to any of those, and so on and so on. But another example of a huge building in Paris, and there are a number of other huge buildings in Paris devoted to museums, but devoted to art or to related topics. But we're going to move right now to discuss six museums devoted to single artists. The museums that we're going to look at are the museums, and I have some notes. The museums are devoted to the artists Delacroix, Moreau, Rodin, Bourdelle, Monet, Picasso. Those are the six names which we're going to dig up. And we start with Delacroix. Now Delacroix, of course, is a very, very important artist. He's considered to be the first artist of the Romantic movement in France. And this is a self-portrait of Delacroix as he looked as a relatively young man. This is the most famous painting by Delacroix, the painting of liberty leading the people. This painting is in the Louvre, and it's a huge painting and has been repeated, satirized, gone through all kinds of things. We think that the liberty, la liberté, here is probably the inspiration for the Statue of Liberty, which is in New York. But anyway, this is an extremely important painting and very, very important when we talk about Delacroix. Another Delacroix painting done before La Liberté, but typical of Romantic paintings, is the treatment of various kinds of epics. And this, of course, is the treatment of Dante. It shows Dante in the crossing through the Inferno, holding his hands high, standing next, of course, to his guide, who is Virgil. And another painting by Delacroix in a slightly different mode, but showing another direction in his painting, and which he shared with other Romantic painters, what we call Orientalism in American painting. Specifically, this depicts women of Algeria, in a harem, or his conception of women of Algeria, and so on. It's rather typical of these women. Now, he spent most of his life in Paris, and he lived in a number of different buildings there over the years, and so on. Relatively late in his life, he only lived, however, 65 years. Relatively late in his life, he was asked to do several paintings for this magnificent church. This church is Saint-Sulpice. Saint-Sulpice is one of the enormous churches in Paris, which the average tourist until recently never even saw. One of the reasons that you don't drive by it very easily, because all the approaches to it are in fairly narrow streets. This is very close to Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and so on. However, this church has enjoyed a tremendous amount of publicity recently because of the book called Da Vinci Code. And so that has given more publicity to this church than anything else. However, it's an extremely important church with one of the best known organs of any church. So magnificent music is associated with this church, and so on. And and the church was begun, the construction began in the early 18th century, but like most churches, it takes a long time to get together. So in the early, or the mid 19th century, Delacroix, as one of the most important artists, was asked to do some paintings for it. And so he moved to an apartment and had a studio not very far away. He moved to this studio in 1857, and he remained there until he died in 1863. So this is, of course, one of the paintings. He did 3 paintings, and which you can still see today when you go there. And this is a painting showing someone being thrown out of one of the temples in Jerusalem. A huge, huge painting. Look at the next one. But nearby, he was able to get an apartment, which satisfied him very well, and was able to have a studio. So this is the square in which his apartment was located. It still looks today as it looked when he moved there in the 1850s. This is the Place de Fürstenberg. Very, very close to Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Indeed, the building you see straight back is a part of the 18th century buildings related to Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Look at the next one. Here we're looking more at the precise building he entered to get into his apartment. We'll look at the next one, and then you go to that entrance and you enter a courtyard, and then from the courtyard, the actual entrance into the apartment, which was on known as the first floor. The ground floor was not the first floor in France. And so this is the entrance to his apartment. And unfortunately, this is smaller than I would like for you to have it, but the apartment was attached to a studio, and here we have, oh, good, this is excellent. And here, this is his studio. You see, it was a very ample studio. He was able to do the paintings there in that studio. And we're seeing it, the next one. Well, maybe we tricked ourselves when we expanded it.
It's all right.
Yeah. And this is the garden. So you see, it was a very lovely place that he lived in the last several years of his life. And then we can now look at a picture inside the house. What happened is, of course, over the years, various other people were able to rent this apartment and so on. But people who were interested in him kept it in mind and so on. And in the 20th century, there was organized an organization called Friends of Delacroix. It was organized when they heard that the apartment was perhaps going to be revised and the studio was going to be taken down. They said, he is so important, we need some recollection of what he had. So the friends got together and created a museum, or created a space in which they did various things in memory of him. They actually rented it from the people who owned it. Then, this was in 1929. In 1952, they learned that the people who owned it were going to do something else, so they were able to buy it in 1952. They raised the money to buy it. And in 1954, they turned it over to the government, and that created the Museum of Delacroix, which contains many small paintings by Delacroix and lots of things related to him. Let's look at another one of the Delacroix. This is another room in that museum. Now, and yet another room in the museum, I think. Oh no, okay. And then finally, it was turned over to the government in 1954. In 1971, it became the National Museum, Delacroix. And as recently as just 2 or 3 years ago, it was directly attached to the Louvre. So now when you get a pass to the Louvre, you can also use it to go to the Museum of Delacroix. And it's not a terribly long walk from the Louvre. This is the shop. All museums now have shops. And this is an example of the shop today in the Musée de Delacroix. So that is a very, very interesting example of a museum in Paris devoted exclusively to a single artist, containing various things which bring attention to him, even though, of course, his major works are actually in the Louvre and not in his museum, which is a small space. The next museum we're going to talk about is the museum which may in fact have inspired most of the other individual museums. This is the museum of the artist Gustave Moreau. Gustave Moreau was born in 1826. He died in 1898. He lived 72 years. He was born to a relatively rich family, and consequently, to the extent that other artists had, he didn't have to worry too much about selling his paintings, and he kept most of them. And so he is regarded as the artist, of course, who was closely associated with symbolism in art. And we'll look at the next one. This is a self-portrait. Look at the next. This is one of his most famous subjects, Salome. His subjects come largely from the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, and so on. And this is Salome, which is one of the subjects. He painted it a number of times. You know, during the 19th century, Salome became the subject of many paintings of plays, of operas, novels, and so on. So his Salome, his painting of Salome, made him closely associated with that. The next one, Samson and Delilah, from the Old Testament, painted by him. And yet another piece. And this is a piece that he did very late in life. This is called Life of Humanity. And it has a number of different topics. At the very top, there is an allusion, of course, to Christ and to the redemption of humanity. The first level, 1, 2, 3 paintings, deal with subjects suggested by Adam and Eve. The next level deal with subjects suggested from Greek mythology and relate to Orestes. And the third deals with Cain and Abel, and so on. So that's one level. This is an example of the symbolism you see. Here again, the top level is supposed to deal with the Golden Age, and the second level deals with the Silver Age, and the third level deals with the Iron Age. And there are yet even more symbolisms there, but this was a work that he did, and which, of course, you have to go to his museum, his house, to see it, because, as I said, he kept most of the paintings in his house. He was highly esteemed in his life. He taught in latter years at the School of Fine Arts, and among his most famous pupils were Rouault, the painter, and also Matisse were pupils of his in the 1880s or 1890s at the École des Beaux-Arts. Nevertheless, as he felt he was approaching the end of life, he decided that he would build 2 or 3 extra stories to his house and arrange everything in it and leave it as a museum to the government. And this, of course, is the very first example of this kind of thing taking place. And of course, the government wasn't fully prepared for it. But nevertheless, he died in 1898, and in 1902, the museum was established, following very much the arrangements that he himself had made. In it, there are at least 1,000 paintings and watercolors, 7,000 drawings, and so on. So now we'll look at some of the pictures of some of the things. Now this is here this is too much. We need to see more of this. It would reduce the side. This is the facade you see of the house that he lived in. And this is the museum today. Yeah, gives us a better view. All right, this is where he, well, I don't know whether he was born in the house, but that's where he lived most of his life, and so on. And this was the house, you see, that he turned over to the government, including stories which are above that level. And then we'll look at the next one. This was his bedroom, and of course it's preserved pretty much as he had it the last years of his life. And you can observe it if you go to the museum. And then adjacent to the bedroom, we have the next one, his study. But as we go to a higher level in the house, we see any number of paintings you see spread around the house. We'll go to the next one. And this is the very top level. These are his paintings, pretty much as he arranged them himself before he passed. And look again, here we see the stairway from the next to the top level, and so on. We'll look at the stairway there, and finally, standing on the stair looking out, you have a sense of his wonderful museum. And so this museum, Gustave-Moreau, is a museum which is not, there are never enormous crowds there, but it's a very important museum, and it really inspired most of the other museums for individuals. All right, the next museum we're going to talk about is the museum associated with the sculptor Rodin, who by the early 20th century was considered the major French sculptor, maybe the major world sculptor of the 19th century. This is a bust of Rodin done by one of his assistants, Bourdelle. The work is by Bourdelle, but it depicts Rodin as a mature person. Next one. This is the most famous of Rodin's sculptures. The thinker, Le Penseur, and this is the original, or at least we presume it's the original. Anyway, it's the one that you find at the Rodin Museum in Paris. There are many, many, many authentic, approved copies of this. As a matter of fact, there are at least 10 in the United States. And then there are a number in other places, altogether 25 or 30 have been authenticated. They came out of Rodin's direct studios and approved. This is Le Penseur, and this is seated in the gardens of the Rodin Museum in Paris. The next museum piece is a group, depicts a historical moment. It's called The Burghers of Calais. And there are a number of approved copies of this as well in the various places. But this is, again, the one that is at the Rodin Museum in Paris. And then the next thing we will look at, of course, is Rodin's Gate of Hell. And there are a number of versions of this, but here again, this is the version that we could see in Paris at the Rodin Museum. Now, Rodin was a slightly controversial sculptor in his latter years, and or in his early years. But in his latter years, he got more and more attention. In one of the famous expositions that the French had every 11 years or so, in 1889, he shared a exhibition with Monet, and they both got very favorable attention. The next exposition was in 1900, and Rodin had a huge one devoted to himself. And as a result of that one, and because of people who visited from all over the world, he was then recognized as perhaps the greatest sculptor of the century, and his work began to become extremely in demand, and that's when it started traveling in many, many parts of the world. It is also possible that around that time, because of the opening of the Moreau Museum, Rodin thought, well, maybe I ought to have one. And so a very interesting event occurred. People, of course, came to him as admirers and what have you. And one of the people who came to him proposing to write a book about him and so on also suggested to him that you ought to have a place in Paris, because Rodin operated basically outside of Paris and in the suburbs or in a nearby town. And at that time, a number of well-known artists were moving to a small palace which had just become available, for rent. And among the people who lived there, Matisse had a place there, a studio there. Jean Cocteau, who was very, very young and who later became, of course, well known as an artist and as a writer, had a place there. The American dancer Isadora Duncan was in this building, but Rodin, as a fairly well-off person, could afford to buy several, or to rent several rooms on the ground floor. And probably while he was there, he decided this would be a good place to have my museum. And because of his friends in the government bought the building, and when Rodin died, he willed the bulk of his holdings to the government, and the Rodin Museum came into being in about 1919. Now, what was this? This is the entrance to the Hotel Buon, which is the name of the place, Hotel Buon. Which was, now this is a view, you see, of the Hotel Buon today, and this is the Rodin Museum. This building was constructed in 1728 and represents the approved style of the small palaces in Paris in that period. Interestingly enough, and most people who go to Paris and see this do not realize that there are a number of other palaces like this in the same neighborhood, none of which is open to the public, because they're all government buildings. The Prime Minister's building is nearby, just a short distance away from this, and it's also on this scale. But because of the Rodin Museum, you can see one of these buildings from the 18th century, which were built, of course, by the very, very rich people of that period. We are close to it, and we've seen it from the garden. The garden is huge, and now we see nearby. And here we have an interior of the museum, another interior of the Rodin Museum. Now, if you arrive at the museum by subway, which is one of the fastest ways of getting there, and you get off at the subway station, Varon, Metro Stop Varon, no, we'll go back, Varon, you see immediately Rodin sculptures. So you know you're in the right place. And so, but the minute you get off the subway, you meet Rodin, and then you go up out of the subway and a short distance away, less than 5 minutes away, you have the Rodin Museum, and you will find, of course, the wonderful things that we saw there. Now, Rodin actually lived before he even got his rooms at the Hotel de Lyon, around 1907 or so, in the country, in a town in the southwest of Paris called Meudon. And this was actually his residence in Meudon in the late 19th century. And this is also a Rodin museum. It is open from about October, open from about April, maybe even March, through October. So in the winter you can't see it, but in the summer it is available to be seen. And then we have also the next item. We'll look at the next item. And this is the gallery at the Meudon, where you have the early plastic versions of most of the Rodin holdings and so on. Now, this next building, no, you're moving too fast. This next building is, well, I'll let people guess. Anybody have any idea what that is?
Tomb?
Huh?
Is it tomb? Is it his tomb?
No, it's not a tomb. But it is this is another Rodin museum. And where is the other Rodin museum?
Looks like Philadelphia.
That's in Philadelphia, precisely. I went to that museum, I think when I was around 13 years old, which would be about 70 years ago. And so I've been acquainted with Rodin for quite a long time. And the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia is, of course, that it's on the Parkway in Philadelphia, down the street from the Philadelphia Museum Park. The collection was made in the 1920s by a man whose name was Mascom, a very, very rich Philadelphian, rich actually from the movie, into building theaters and so on. He even built a magnificent theater, which unfortunately was taken down. But he made these, he was probably inspired, you see, by the Rodin Museum, which had been created in 1917, 1918 in France. Decided he would buy all the Rodin things that were available and have his own Rodin museum in Philadelphia. He died before the museum was thoroughly gotten together, but it opened in 1929. And now let's look at the interior of the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia. And this is the interior of the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia. So you see, you don't have to go far, not too far, to see a Rodin museum. You can actually see one in Philadelphia. All right, we will move on to the next person. Now, remember at the beginning of looking at Rodin, we saw the sculpture of Rodin, and that was done by an associate, an assistant of his, Bourdelle, Antoine Bourdelle, and this is a photograph of Bourdelle holding one of his small pieces in his hand. Okay, we'll look at this. Now this is Bourdelle's most famous sculpture, the Hercules the Archer. There are many versions of this made in various sizes, but this is his most famous work of sculpture.
You know there's one here at our museum.
Yeah.
New Orleans Museum.
Right, no.
They're all around. There are several of them, and they come in various sizes as well, but that's the Bourdelle Archer. All right? Now, another thing that Bourdelle was responsible for are the relief sculptures in the very, very famous Paris theater. And I'll talk about it for a little while because we probably should. This theater was finished around 1913, and it is called the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. The Champs-Élysées Theater. It's not on the Champs-Élysées. They just like the name. But it's a short distance from the Champs-Élysées. But it was definitely a modern theater, and many theaters just around the world today were directly influenced by this theater. The theater, of course, achieved a certain amount of scandal almost immediately because this is where the famous Russian ballet Russe, did the work by Nijinsky based on the music of Stravinsky. and caused a great deal of scandal when that work was done. That we'll look then at the next piece. This is one of the reliefs by Bourdelle in that theater, some of which were directly inspired by dancers, including Nijinsky and Isadora Duncan. And I should mention that that theater is still a very active theater in France, and many famous things have happened there. For example, the production called Les Deux Nègres, and which brought Josephine Baker to Paris, was there in 1925. And Alvin Ailey's first appearance in Paris, his company's first appearance, was at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. As a matter of fact, he appeared in Paris a number of times after that, but never again was he booked into that theater, which annoyed him greatly because he thought he should really always go back to that theater. He saw it. But this is the work of Bourdelle at the, now Bourdelle, naturally, since he had been closely associated with Rodin, perhaps early on thought that he should have a museum of his work, and he did a lot of work. And there is now a Bourdelle museum, but it came some years after he died, because he died actually in 1929. And the theater, the museum comes into being only in about 1949. His wife and daughter turned his works and the building that he actually lived in over, and the studio over to the government. So this is a view of the courtyard of the Musée Voltaire. We'll look at the next one. And this is another view of and yet another view of it. And then we can look at one more view. There's a huge room which has been added in modern times where you can put in his huge sculptures, because there are many, many huge sculptures of his. And finally, a small studio room is there that can be visited. All right, there are altogether about 900 sculptures in the collection there. Now, the next artist we're going to talk about is Claude Monet, who was a contemporary of Rodin. They were born in the same year. They were both born in 1840. And I should mention now that at the moment, Monet is very much in the news, because even as I am speaking, there's a huge Monet show in Paris at what's called the Grand Palais. The show opened about a month ago and goes on to January, and all the tickets have already sold out. Wow. Now, the Monet show, it's the largest of the Monet shows, but done so far in France. And there are many other, of course, Monet shows which have been done elsewhere. I mean, in the United States, we have a Monet show at least once every 10 years, somewhere or the other. So Monet is an extremely important artist. In his own lifetime, and shortly after the Rodin Museum had been created, Monet had the idea that maybe at least some of his things ought to be on permanent display. So we start looking at his paintings. Now, this painting of Monet, and here again is a side note that you should be aware of, is actually called, and this was done quite early, this is one of his earliest paintings that was on view, is called Impression of the Sun Rising, Impression Soleil, and he was on exhibit at a show, including a number of other artists associated with him. And one of the critics who didn't like any of the paintings in the show said the very idea they should call them all impressions. And that's where the word impressionism was created. It was created as a derogatory term. So, and this painting is the term which inspired impressionism. So it's a very, very important painting. And indeed, its importance is extreme at this very moment, because this is a painting which we find in the Monet Museum in Paris. When they put the show on at the Grand Palais earlier this year, the curator of that show requested the museum to lend this painting for the show, and the museum refused. So we had a big scandal in Paris. The museum, in turn, decided that they would do their own Monet show. So there are two Monet shows in Paris on now. One at the Monet Museum, where there'd be a Monet show anyway, and then the show, the big show at the Grand Palais. But probably you would have trouble getting into each of them right now at this very moment. But wait a few months, you can probably get into the Monet Museum without any great problem. All right, we'll look at another Monet. Now, late in life, or not so late as a matter of fact, Monet lived a long time. He was born in 1840 and died in 1926, which meant he lived 86 years. Around 1900, a little after, he started focusing on painting water lilies. And that's the main thing he painted for the next 25 years. One of the names for the various varieties, really, Nymphaeus is the most common name. So this is an example of his Nymphaeus painting, one of his Nymphaeus paintings. He did quite enough of them, so they're sort of everywhere. The Museum of Modern Art in New York has two of them, which we saw in Atlanta quite recently, but which are on view in New York right at the moment. And we'll look at another one, which is also the next one.
Yeah, it's kind of...
All right, we'll go, can you go back to the earlier one? Then? We have... Yeah. All right, so this is the extension of the ones we have. But anyway, this is, of course, a very, very characteristic work of his work. Water lily, water lily. Now, so where could he be viewed? The government had recently, and he was on excellent terms by this time with very high officials of the government, had decided to turn a building in the gardens of the Tuileries, which is right on the Place de la Concorde in Paris, the building called the Orangerie. It's come up. Here we have the Orangerie, which is in the gardens of the Tuileries. It almost has a twin on the other side. The twin is called the Jeu de Paume. And the Jeu de Paume was very, very famous as a museum of Impressionism for many, many, many years. Here, the Orangerie, they decided that they would add to the Orangerie 2 rooms in which they could use a tremendous number or tremendously large example of the paintings by Monet. And so in 1927, they installed in 2 rooms. This is how they look today. They've been revised 2 or 3 times. But this is one of the oval rooms, and the next one, another oval room. And then finally, this is, of course, what we have looking up close in the room at the Orangerie. So since 1927, most of the time, if you went to Paris, you could see Monet on this monumental scale in the Museum of the Orangerie. Now, beyond that, however, his surviving son had quite a few of his father's paintings, and he decided that he would will those to the government, or as a matter of fact, to a special area of the government, known as the Academy of Fine Arts, and that possibly they would have a special collection of them. Now, there existed in Paris an independent museum, which was in the hands actually of the Academy of Fine Arts, called the Museology. That's the name of the person who turned his mansion and his collection over. His collection, however, was a collection mainly of decorative arts from the period of Napoleon the First. We'll look at another view. All right, here we have another view of the Montmartre, and again, and this is the interior of Montmartre, showing basically decorative arts from the period of the First Empire. In order to incorporate the Monet, they had to go and dig up. So a subterranean construction was done, and we do that, and so we'll look at the next one. And so underneath that standard museum and its gardens, we have, in a sense, a repetition of the Monet oval showings, except they're individual paintings, you see, including the painting I showed you at the very beginning. And then we'll look again at the next one, and so on. So you visit the Musée Marmottan, which is now called Marmottan Monet, and that's, of course, the difference when they put Monet there was that Marmottan was rarely visited. Now, of course, Marmottan is visited intensely, and this has been there for the last 30 years or so. Now, at the same time that the son turned over his paintings to the Musée, to the Academy of Fine Arts, he also turned over the house that Monet had lived in the last 30 or 40 years of his life. Remember, he lived to be in his 80s. And that is in the town of Giverny, a town which is on the edge of Normandy, about an hour northwest of Paris. And this is the home of, in Giverny, which is now a major tourist place to visit. What they did there was to recreate the atmosphere that Monet attempted to repeat. That actually opened around 1980, and since then has been. And then the garden, and this of course is the garden in which the water lilies were, and this is how it looks today. Here again, you visit this from April to October. Now the next artist we will look at is the artist Pablo Picasso, born in 1881. He lived to 1973, which meant he lived 92 years, and so on, and he remained busy most of that time. We'll look at another one of his paintings. This is a painting that he did when he was in his 20s, from the so-called Blue Period. And then we'll look at another painting of his. This is a painting from shortly after that, from the so-called Pink Period. And then this painting was done in 1907. It is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. This painting is in New York at the Museum of Modern Art. And so on, they had a very special celebration of it there 3 years ago, celebrating the 100th anniversary of this painting. And this is also a painting of his which reflects some of the influence of African art on him. You see two of the faces on the right, the faces on the right are derived from African art masks. And Picasso went through a period, and a number of other artists as well, in which they drew on African art for inspiration, and that created the Cubist movement, of which Picasso is important. We'll look at one more. Oh, this is a slightly later Cubist painting, three musicians. And then finally, we'll look at another painting, and this, of course, is perhaps the most famous Picasso painting. This is Guernica, a painting which he did in 1937, was exhibited in Paris in 1937, toured extensively in the world. It depicts, of course, a horrible event in the Spanish Civil War when a German aviation group bombed the city in what is now in the northern part of Spain, actually it's the Basque country, and so in the town called Guernica. And it was an enormous scandal when it occurred, and Picasso, of course, was so affected by it that he created this painting. He was asked to create a painting representing Spain in the exposition in Paris in 1937, and this is the painting which he created. It toured extensively, and finally it was felt that it toured so much the painting was in some danger, and as a result it came to New York and was put in the Museum of Modern Art, where it remained for many, many, many years. The Museum of Modern Art had it from the 1950s until 1981. What happened in 1981 is that the New York Museum of Modern Art, which is a private institution, was told by the Spanish government that they understood that Picasso had willed it to Spain and that it was overdue there. Now, the Museum of Modern Art, of course, interpreted Picasso's will. Picasso said he wanted it to go to Spain when Spain became a democracy again, or maybe a republic and so on. And of course, Spain was what? And still is, and a monarchy. But it is a constitutional monarchy, and finally, the Museum of Modern Art finally had to say, well, we have to let it go. They didn't want it to go. So it is now back in Spain. It went to the Prado and was there for a number of years, and it is now in a museum devoted to modern art with lots of Picasso's in it. The museum is called, named for the Queen of Spain, Reina Sofia. And this is how it looks today in the Reina Sofia. And I was very privileged to be able to see it just a few months ago in Madrid. Now, Picasso, when he died, left quite a few paintings to his heirs. And of course, they were all French and French citizens. And their tax on his paintings would have been so enormous that it was decided that what they should do would be to turn paintings over to the French government and so on. Well, this didn't really insult anybody very much because they said, well, we definitely need a Picasso museum and so on. So therefore, the Picasso Museum in France was created. I need to tell you a little more about Picasso, though, because he is, of course, an extremely important artist. He was born in 1881 when, in the town of Malaga, in the south of Spain. When he was 10 years old, his father was a painter and a professor of painting, moved to teach at a school in Galicia, in the northwestern part of Spain. And then after a few years, the father moved to Barcelona. So we associate Pablo more with Barcelona, because when he went to Barcelona, he went to art school where his father was teaching, and he was 13 years old. By the time he was 16, they told him, well, he could go to Madrid and work in the major school there. He got to Madrid, he didn't like it much. He felt he wasn't learning much in the school and all of that. And so when he was 19, he went to Paris. But by the time he was 16, he could paint as well as anybody, anywhere. And therefore, that shows you, of course, how he rapidly developed all of these other things. They're very standard paintings of his, which he did when he was 17 and 18, and so on. There's even a legend that when he was 16, his father looked at one of his paintings and he decided he himself would never paint again. That's not true. The father painted right till he died, but so it was. Now, this is the entrance to the museum that came into being in France in 1985. The building, however, is from the 17th century. And this building is a very, very impressive building called the Hôtel Salé. Wow. It was built around 1656. It was built for a very, very rich man who was a government collector. He collected the tax on salt, which was a very, very big tax back then. This was in the reign of Louis XIV. Louis XIV devoted himself to getting rid of certain things which were going on in France, and there was one man he had to get rid of, Fouquet. He also decided to get rid of a few other people, so this gentleman, who was probably a very nice guy, but he was collecting all this money, so the king freed him from collecting the money and put him in jail. So he had this house, only lived in it 1 year, and then through the succeeding years, it went to a number of other rich people, and by the 18th century, it became a school, and it had a variety of other things. But the building is quite substantial. We'll look at it from the other side. And this is, of course, we're looking at the building this is from the mid 17th century. And so, the Hotel Salé. Now it's called Salé, in French, it just means salted. So it's a joking title given by the French people, or by Parisians, to the building called the Salt Palace, or the Salted Palace, and so on, because the money created all came from the tax on salt. And so on. Well, that's how, now this is all right. The only thing which remains from the original building that you can see today is the stairway. This is the magnificent staircase. And so on. Everything else, of course, has been changed over the years as they worked on the various operations. It was 2 or 3 different kinds of schools between the late 19th and the early 20th century. All right, now we'll look at the museum. This is a room, an interior in the Picasso Museum today. Another interior in the Picasso Museum. All of these, of course, are Picasso works. Another interior in the Picasso Museum. All right, we'll stop at that point to point out that altogether there are 3,000 items in the possession of this museum. Paintings, sculptures, prints, and then Picasso himself had a very large collection. He had work by Degas, Cézanne, Matisse, and that too is a part of the work that went there. And it gives you a good history of Picasso because there are lots of early Picassos. Now the early Picassos, of course, had been sold, you know, when Picasso was young. But when Picasso got very old, remember he lived to be 92, he started buying back early Picassos. And so on, and he was one of the few people who could afford them. And so on. So there was a magnificent Picasso collection in Picasso's hands when he died, and it is from that the French were able to create, the government was able to create the Picasso Museum, which came into being in 1985. Now that, of course, is not really the first Picasso museum. One of his associates tried to open a museum in the 60s, before Picasso himself died, in Barcelona. And I visited that museum many, many, many years ago, and there was almost nothing in it because Picasso hadn't said anything to them and what have you. However, there is, of course, a Picasso museum functioning today in Barcelona, but the first one was created in '63. Okay, we'll look at this is part of, but we need to hold him. Picasso, as I mentioned, he was born in Malaga. So he left when he was 10 years old. I don't think he ever went back. But Malaga doesn't hold that against him. They created we have to skip one point though. No, we'll go back. And then the next picture.
This one?
No. Okay, now this, of course, is another Picasso museum in France. This is in the town of Antibes on the Riviera. The town of Antibes, this is a palace, a 17th or 18th, 17th century palace that Picasso lived in for about a year. So it's associated with Picasso. And so the town of Antibes decided that they would create a Picasso museum. So there are 2 Picasso museums in France. There is the town, the one in Antibes, as well as the one in Paris, and so on. All right, now, next. In Barcelona, the Picasso Museum is about 4 or 5 relatively small palaces side by side, which have been merged. And this is a courtyard in that Picasso Museum in Barcelona. And then, next one. This is a palace in Malaga, which is now the museum in Malaga. So in Malaga, we have a Picasso museum. Picasso was born there. So next, this is the building he was born in. You see, he didn't come from a poor family necessarily. This is, he was a middle-class family. He was born in this building, and this building is also now associated with Picasso. It's called the Fondation Picasso. And the international airport in Malaga is also called the Picasso Airport. So you can't skip Picasso if you go to Malaga. All right. Now this is toward the end of our lecture. We go back and see another huge museum in Paris. This museum is the museum known as the Musée d'Orsay. The building was constructed in 1900 and it was a railroad station. They decided to do the smallest railroad station. But the railroad station never really worked out. There wasn't really enough space for the trains to come in and out. This was in a fairly crowded part, and so on. So eventually only suburban trains came in and out of it and what have you. And then as a station it closed down completely. So it was empty for a while, and there was even some consideration that maybe it needs to be torn down. However, certain people immediately made it a historical building because, of course, it's one of the magnificent buildings built during the period of 1900 for the Great Festival of 1900. And the decision was to turn it into a museum devoted to the 19th century, or from the 19th century beginning around 1830. And this would take some of the pressure off the Louvre, which of course still has a lot of stuff in it. But they proposed to do the museum around in the late 70s and collect it mainly from the Louvre. But most important, of course, they got the whole holdings of the Jeu de Paume, which were Impressionism. So you go to this museum today to see the Impressionists. However, the artists that we've talked about are also there in that museum. There are 5 works by Delacroix in this museum, or this is the museum as we see it today. There are 5 works by Delacroix, whereas of course there are 40 by Delacroix in the Louvre. There are 8 works by Moreau. Well, remember most of Moreau's works are in his own museum. There are 93 works by Rodin. There are 16 works by Bourdelle. There are 88 paintings by Monet, whereas there are only 3 by Monet in the Louvre. And of course there are no Picassos here because this is 19th century and Picasso was only 20 years old at the end of the 19th century, 19 at the end of the 19th century, so there are no Picassos in this particular museum. All right, I think that's it. So it's wonderful being here. Wonderful talking. We are perfectly willing to answer a few questions, if I can answer them. Yeah.
How does the government fund these museums?
Well, you see, we could say maybe the Louvre is a good example. The fact that from the very beginning of the creation of the Louvre was created by the government. And the notion, therefore, is that the government has to underwrite these museums. And this is generally true in Europe, but nowhere more true than in France. And so in France, and France is most famous, I think, for the idea that the major institutions of that sort need to be funded by the government. So there's no resistance, to funding it. Now, in recent years, there has been some development of finding money elsewhere for them, but until recently that was not the case. The government just took this as one of the government functions.
I can understand the elderly people visiting these museums. The generation today, do they show any interest in museums by visiting and seeing what was created in the past?
Oh yes, of course in France the Louvre is visited every day by tens of thousands of people, literally tens of thousands every day. Including of course tremendous number of foreigners and what have you. But visiting the major museums is part of the educational system in France. And there are museums in every city of any size and so on. So the school children, you know, are taken there, and it's a very important part of their lives. And then they've developed various kinds of activities in recent years which encourage people to visit museums. Every year, for example, there's what they call the White Night. I think it's in October, and they keep the museum open all night and encourage people to come for that. And there are various kinds of techniques for bringing them to the attention of the people. Nevertheless, on an ordinary day, most of the museums, which are not the most sensational ones, may not be terribly crowded. Usually I go to most museums and there's lots of room for me to move around.
I can't remember, but is it Paris? The museums are free, or is it
London?
Well, in London. I know.
In England, they had a tradition of fairly free museums. In Paris, the museums were nearly always some cost for going in. However, the museums in Paris are divided into various categories. There are the museums of the national government. There are the museums of the city of Paris. Then there are some private museums. Now, the city of Paris itself, about 10 or 12 years ago, decided that admission to all of its museums would be free. So, of the museums that I've just mentioned, Bourdelle is a museum of the city of Paris, and ordinarily that is a free museum. The national museums have, you know, fees of various kinds, as well as the museum which belongs to the Institute. That would be the Monet Museum, and so on. But there are lots of free museums in Paris, but those are the museums that belong to the city of Paris.
Is photography allowed in these museums? Can you?
It depends upon someone. At this point, they hardly resist because of modern cameras. They just insist that you can't use flash.
Flashes because of the color
Yes, and so on.
impact.
But in general, you see people moving through the museums. Some people are not even seeing the paintings themselves, just the cameras see them.
Dr. Long, I was wondering if you heard about opening the Louvre in Dubai, and how do you feel about this?
Open the Louvre where?
In Dubai.
Oh, well, that's very controversial in France. However, I would say the objection could not be so strong as to have prevented it. You see, but the Louvre had already engaged in some extensions in France itself. There's a branch of the Louvre recently opened in the town of Metz that nobody even heard of before they put the museum there, I think. And as a matter of fact, just in a few weeks in Atlanta, the director of the Metz Louvre at Metz is coming to speak in Atlanta. And then for 3 years, you know, we had the Louvre in Atlanta. That is to say, at the High Museum, we had a series of exhibitions consisting of some very important paintings. In other words, that was objected to by some people in France. But the Louvre has so much stuff that they could easily let a few things go, and most people wouldn't have missed them. They won't send the Mona Lisa, of course, but they do send, you know, various things. So that doesn't really disturb people too much.
Referring back to the sculpture called Thinker that Rodin did, there's a difference between a replica and something that's been authenticated.
Well, you see, when a sculptor does a given work, he usually decides that it can be reproduced a number of times. Maybe you set some limit to the number of times it can be reproduced. Or the reproduction may go into the hands of somebody whose authority he recognizes. Maybe, if, for example, the work is originally done in clay, and then, you know, it's then done in plaster, and then it is done in bronze, and all of these. And so there are a lot of technicians, you see, involved in it anyway as it proceeds. So basically, the sculptor can decide how many works, how many representations, how many copies of the work would be official. Now, of course, for work of Rodin's, there are many unofficial things moving around as well, and so on. But he himself approved in life perhaps the number of copies of Le Penseur, or the thinker, that we have, and left authority to, some heirs to approve it. As a matter of fact, now they have to be approved by the French government.
So related to that question is, so when, for example, obviously he has to make a clay model, as you have said, and then he would send the model to for the cauldron, to kiln, to make the bronze, to cast the bronze, right?
Oh,
so,
yes.
So how does he maintain, the authenticity of these copies after a number of copies? Because after they make multiple copies, the details tend to blur, right? So how do they maintain the quality of those copies after a number of?
A given sculptor would review every piece. He didn't even do the first one in bronze himself. He wasn't a foundry person.
Right.
But he had to approve each one, and so on.
I have another question. How do you evaluate the exhibition designs in these museums? Because I saw the walls like crowded with big paintings, and from the ceiling to the floor. So as museum professionals, how we evaluate this? This is a good display, they could have done better, or how we can approach it?
Well, now, with the example that we had where we saw the paintings on Moreau things, of course, that's the way he left them. And he may, of course, have been simply motivated by the fact that there's only so much space that he had. However, remember, in general, in the 19th century, on a wall, many paintings would be held on the wall. The idea of paintings being held one by one by one by one was a 20th century idea. We don't find, when you look at any representation of paintings in museums as well as in private collections, you find that they were put together. And then our new aesthetics demand that we let each painting stand by itself. So for modern museums, paintings are in the Picasso Museum today. Each Picasso stands, pretty much alone. Of course, this is the truth throughout the 20th century. But we go back to the 19th century and earlier, the use of several paintings interacting with each other was the way they were done at the time, and if we want to represent what was done at the time, we would continue that.
Obviously, so for the museums which, for example, are the federal government, the government controlled by the French government, or for the museums of Paris, do they have like a central cultural agency which allocates money, budget for different museums, and then obviously there will be a lot of politics involved. I'm the Rodin Museum, and you're that's kind of Monet Museum. So how your museum gets that chunk of money while my museum gets less money. So how is the money or budget allocated, distributed among different museums?
Well, and the French government has an agency devoted to the museums, and I would say that deep politics are not really concerned. The artistic decisions are really made by people who are bureaucrats and so on. The politicians, don't have any direct involvement. They are involved in putting in the overall funds, but the disposition of it remains in the hands of bureaucracies in France.
Where would one find or view the 7,000 drawings of, not Matisse is a painter, Gustave Moreau?
Oh, well.
Is that a good place?
Oh, yes, they are at that museum. One could, a person who has a valid reason for wanting to see the paintings, they're available. And the drawings.
Right.
Yeah, they are available. When you visit the museum, you may find 2 or 3 people there actually working, studying the various drawings and so on. They're all available.
I'm trying to start a space museum in New Orleans. New Orleans had contributed to the space program. There are museums in other towns, like Huntsville and Florida, and from what I understand, Texas and other places. And I'm wondering if you can give me any information on how we go about getting some help from the government to do this.
Well, our government, you about the national government? You heard about the last election? What we will be hearing about actually very shortly is an attempt in the Congress to cut off whatever money is already going to museums and so on. The people who are now, who are at least momentarily in control of the government are very, very anti-activities like that. So this is certainly not, no bureaucrat at the moment would even invite you to submit a proposal to deal with a new museum. And museums which already have grants and so on are going to be in some trouble in the next 2 or 3 years. It won't last forever, but definitely our disposition is not to support museums and new museums.
Well, maybe I should just stick to the companies that also have contributed, right?
Possibly, yes, that's quite possible. Though everybody would say, of course, that Americans ought to be able to support their own museums. Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Yes.
Yes, you mentioned that there are currently 2 exhibitions on Monet.
Yeah, in Paris.
You said the Montmartre. What do you think is the French people's romance with the Impressionist period, with all these great artists that you mentioned in their museums? What is their romance with the Impressionists?
Well, the truth of the matter is that the French do not have a great romance with the Impressionists. The feeling is that the Monet exhibit, which is now being held, is long overdue. That for a long time, Monet was, in spite of the fact he was a major artist and very important, that he was not held in all that high esteem in France. He was held in higher esteem in many other parts of the world. In the United States, among people interested in the Impressionists, and in England and all that, he was thought to be more important, and the French, paid attention to him. So there's a great feeling in Paris right now that this exhibit, which just opened and will be open, as I said, until January, is a rather late affirmation of his importance and so on. So the French are not, they couldn't ignore Impressionism. I've done Impressionism in the French movement, but their enthusiasm for it was not outrageous.
With so many monuments and museums in Paris, art is being produced. In the future, are they likely to take over more train stations, or how do they accommodate art? Is it growing art?
Well, I don't indulge in predictions or in prophecies. I'm a historian. I look at what happens and so on, what have you. They have constantly, over the last 25 or 30 years, they have had to create more and more or to renovate or to reorganize museums in France. They have just created, I didn't go into this at all in my talk, a very recent museum created in the last 15 years in France is a museum called the Musée du Quai. What is the museum that I am reaching for? Quai Branly, the Musée du Quai Branly. That's a brand new museum, which caused all kinds of controversy as to what they were doing. And to do it, they had to raid 2 or 3 other museums to get the content of the museum, and so on. But the Quai Branly itself, I encourage you to look at go to the web and look up Quai Branly, because B-R-A-N-L-Y, the Musée du Quai Branly, because all kinds of controversies were created about it. The architecture was controversial. Big what?
The one that looks like it's got huge tubes like...
no, that's the Pompidou, that's 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And so, no, Branly is quite recent. And they had many innovations there and so on and what have you, but it created quite a controversy. But it's a busy museum now. And incidentally, since I'm mentioning the web, for Monet, I would suggest you go to the web and look up Monet2010.com. Monet2010.com, because that gives you the information on the show, which is at the Grand Palais, and they created a magnificent web for that show. It's incredible. While you were looking at it, the paintings are changing and so on, so it's very, very interesting. Monet2010.com.
So I think the art pieces could be distinguished in the era in which they were made, like the Baroque and the Rococo eras. Can you distinguish?
Oh, they get their full attention in the various museums devoted to them, and particularly in terms of there are museums. You have the major museum, like the Louvre itself, which is enormous, has special sections devoted to the work of the Renaissance and the work of the Baroque and so on. So they're not in any sense neglected. And then there's some other museums which cover them as well. For example, there's a museum in Paris, Museum of the Petit Palais. This is a museum devoted of the city of Paris itself. And it covers history from the late Middle Ages down to modern times and whatever. So it's covered in a number of museums.
Yeah, speaking of Rococo, these days is a museum that's called the Watteau Museum. No, Watteau. Well, no.
Rococo?
Yeah, Rococo style.
There is, for example, in Paris, a museum devoted to the 18th century.
Okay.
It's called the Museum Cognac-Jet. That's another museum of the city of Paris, so it's free to visit. And that is put into a palace, though, of the late 16th century. And so on. It had another location originally, but it was moved there about 20 years. Cognac-Jet, yes. And it's 18th century, so it goes through.
I was just wondering, I know when Picasso and some of the artists around the turn of the century first saw African art, it was in like curio shops. In Paris, have they ever taken African art seriously? Like we have the National Museum of African Art at the Smithsonian. Where would one see?
Well, that's one of the items in this museum I just mentioned, the Quai Branly. But the Quai Branly, when it came into being, absorbed completely the holdings of the Museum of African Art, or African and Oceanic Art, which was created around 1960 and was lasted until about 10 years ago. Then there is in Paris a museum devoted to African art, a small museum, a private museum called the Museology, and that opened about 20 years ago. Any other questions?
You mentioned the Mona Lisa in the Louvre.
Yes.
Was that a legal acquisition? And the second question is that plexiglass or glass that they have, protective shield or something in front of it?
Well, I can't give you any details about the protection, but I can tell you a whole lot about how the painting got there. The Mona Lisa was brought to France by Da Vinci. He never departed from it in life, and he died in France. So the Mona Lisa was with him in France. It went immediately from his estate to the estate of the King of France. So there has never been a time when the Mona Lisa did not belong to France, particularly when you regard the king as being France. At the period of Louis XIV, it was at Versailles, Louis XIV, and so on. But it's never been out of France, except when it was stolen around 1910, 1911, where it disappeared for 2 or 3 years. And that was a great mystery. They checked on a few people. Indeed, one of the people who was queried about stealing it was Picasso. But he had nothing to do with it, but they were desperate to find somebody to say, maybe he took it. And so Picasso was brought in and questioned. And so on. It was taken by a gentleman from Italy who lived in France and was working at the Louvre and figure out, take it. Now, why it isn't really known why he took it. He had a reason he gave. He said that he had taken it from France, so he didn't know about it, and therefore he thought it was his duty as an Italian to take it back to Italy. But had he done any checking at all, he would know that Leonardo himself took it to France and had been there ever since. But fortunately, he kept it under his bed or in the closet, so it didn't suffer too much while it was away. But it was away out of the Louvre for 2 or 3 years, around 1910, 1911, and so on. Since then, they've taken, they paid a little more attention to it, and it hasn't been easy for it to move around too much. What was that? Oh.
He's asking if Matisse has his own museum as well?
Not in Paris. There's a Matisse museum in Nice.
In Nice?
Yes. A rather large Matisse museum in Nice. Yes. And then, of course, there are the Matisse works, which in a chapel, here also in the south of France, in Vence, the town of Vence, and so on.
Is the Rosetta Stone going to be going home?
I doubt it.
The British are not
it isn't even clear where home is for it. When the government of Egypt had no great interest at all in anything there until the last 40 or 50 years, you see. And had it been left entirely to the then government, it might have been chopped up. Well, I think that may be one more question.
I just wanted to make a presentation certificate of appreciation. This is from Southern University New Orleans, certificate of appreciation. This certificate is presented to Dr. Richard Long for sharing the single artist museums of Paris with us Thursday, November 18th, 2010. And it's signed by Dr. Ejiaga, Dr. Adeboye, Dr. Sara Hollis, and Dr. Poe, the chancellor.
Well, thank you very much.